Hello YouTube. I will continue exploration of the possible locations of the ancient Atlantis. And today I want to turn my attention to Africa and a few other places. And I do want to start with my favorite experts on Africa, Lawrence George Green, who was a South African journalist and author. Again, he ranks as one of the most prolific writers to come out of Africa. He published on average a book a year between 1933 and 1972. And in all, he produced 34 books, a number of stories for foreign and local magazines, and many newspaper articles and letters. I found his books in Cape Town back in 1980s, and years later I learned that there was a Russian translation of Green's books under the title The Last of Secrets of Old Africa, something like that. And there were quite a lot of interesting materials in it. And I want to show you what Green published about the hypothesis of Atlantis and Africa. And consider the time it was written. It was late 1960s and early 1970s. But I also will add information about a very interesting discovery in Mozambique towards the end of this video. Let me also mention that I was interested in Southern Africa primarily because of Ivan Yefremov's knowledge of the continent's secrets. I also did my research in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula twice in my life. Listen to what Green revealed and you might find patterns too. So Atlantis, the greatest mystery of the ocean, the undying legend of the lost continent, has its root in Africa. Until now, it generates an abundant literature, both artistic and scientific. Whoever succeeds in proving that Plato's account of Atlantis is the truth will undoubtedly be crowned with glory. Lawrence Green knew that the former curator of the Cape Town Museum sent his reliable assistants to St. Helena to study the tools of primitive men allegedly found there. The hypothesis turned out to be wrong. The processed stones found on the island turned out to be natural rock fragments and not the work of primitive men. Imagine how many scientific theories would have been untenable if such a discovery turned out to be true. So the lost continent still causes controversy and confuses the best minds. Remember where it all started. The Greek philosopher Plato reported on the mainland located on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar, a continent that is larger than Africa and Asia combined. Within one day and one night, the mainland was split by an earthquake and swallowed up by the deep sea. A magical, highly civilized country with flourishing cities, palaces, temples, canals and bridges has perished. And of course, there was a lot of gold, silver, ivory and beautiful women. Everyone enjoyed life in this utopian country as much as they could, and the Atlantean warriors armed with darts periodically raided North Africa and once foolishly attacked even Athens, but were put to flight and forced out of the Mediterranean. Plato even indicated the date of the catastrophe, as a result of which Atlantis sank to the seabed, and it was 9600 BC. For many centuries, the legends of Atlantis was perceived as an indisputable fact. After all, Plato was a serious author and did not tell fantastic stories. However, he apparently realized that not everyone would believe him, and therefore added, "The legend of Atlantis is not a fairy tale at all, but a true story." In support of these words, he referred to the opinion of his predecessor, Solon, who had heard the story from the Egyptian priests. However, already in the 17th century, scientists were overcome by doubts, but critics quickly bit their tongues when the deep-sea measurements made at the end of the 19th century in the North and South Atlantic discovered an underwater ridge that lay in the middle of the ocean and rose up 9,000 feet above the bottom level. The ridge runs from the Arctic to the Antarctic. While sailing on the Atlantic Ocean, Lawrence Green often observed individual peaks of this ridge. These are the islands of Madeira, the Canaries, the rocks of St. Paul, where the ridge approaches Brazil, St. Helena, Tristan and Goch, where it again departs from the continent. Please see my video about the Soviet scientific exploration of the area in the playlist titled Atlantis. I think you'll be amazed. Well, to continue, giant piles of reefs, a ridge that hides under the water and sometimes protrudes above it. They're quite convincing evidence of a sunken continent. But when did it happen? As far as Green knew, scientists believed that Atlantis existed in ancient times, about 60 million years ago, even before humans appeared on Earth. Those who, to one degree or another, accept Plato's message about Atlantis on faith are now in the minority. However, let's listen to them. Supporters of the existence of Atlantis point primarily to the remarkable commonality of ancient civilizations, architecture, customs, and religions of South America, North America, and Western Europe. Sun worshippers lived on both sides of the ocean. The Aztec had a legend about the flood. It was shared by both Hebrews and residents of Babylon. The mysterious Basque language in the Pyrenees, which is not based on any of the European languages, has, however, similarities with the language of the American Aborigines. Pyramids are found not only in Egypt, but also on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Both countries, separated by thousands of kilometers, mummified the dead and put almost identical objects in their graves. The American Indians have a legend about gods, white-skinned foreigners who live on an island in the ocean to the east of America. The Mediterranean peoples once believed in a blessed country in the west. Well, then you have this enigma or riddle of jade. In Mayan burials in Central America, very beautiful ornaments made of green jade are found. In the early burials, there were large pieces of stone. In the later ones, there were significantly ones reduced in size. There are no jade deposits anywhere in Central or South America. It is assumed that jade was brought there from Atlantis. Professor Edward Hall, who served as president of the Royal Geological Society of Ireland, firmly believed in the existence of Atlantis. The flora and fauna of both hemispheres supports the geological theory that life began from some common center in the Atlantic Ocean, according to Hall. Before and during the Ice Age, large continental bridges crossed the Atlantic in the north and south. I draw this conclusion based on a thorough study of deep-sea sonar measurements plotted on Admiralty maps. Another Irish geologist, Professor Sharp, believed that when man appeared on Earth, Madeira and the Azores were still connected to the Iberian Peninsula. He extended this outgrowth of the continent south to the island of St. Helena and believed that the continent began to descend towards the end of Tertiary time, but up to certain parts of it, which later became islands. People could still move overland. Plants and animals also show striking similarities. Indeed, there are identical species and genera in America and Africa. Ants, moths, butterflies, earthworms, slugs, snails, and ground clams can travel short distances, but it is unlikely that they would be able to cross the Atlantic Ocean. A mainland breach in the Atlantic could also explain the presence of some lizards in Chile, close to North African species, and the 10-legged freshwater crustaceans known on both sides of the ocean. The monk seal is an excellent circus performer, but generally a very sedentary animal that never goes far from the ground. It is found both in the Mediterranean and on the islands of the West Indies. Wild goats and rabbits were first discovered by travelers in the Azores. One island, San Miguel, was then called Goat Island, and Florshie was formerly Rabbit Island. If these mammals are really of local origin, then they could once get to the Azores by the mainland bridge, and when Atlantis perished, survived on the highlands that rose above the water. Geologists who support the theory of Atlantis were quite pleased with the samples taken recently from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, as well as some other studies of the displacement of underwater layers. It turned out that Sabrina, the volcanic island in the Azores group, disappeared already in the historical times, just like the Great Atlantis. A cable ship operating 500 miles north of the Azores had dropped the cats to 1700 fathoms. They had brought fragments of glacis, vitreous, or glass-like lava to the surface. The director of the Geological and Topographic Service in France, Dr. Pierre Termure, who specially studied the lava after the disaster in Montpellier, said about the extracted samples, "If the lava was formed underwater, it would have to crystallize. However, the lava remained glass-like, and this confirms the fact that its solidification could only occur at atmospheric pressure. Thus, the current seabed was once land or mountain covered with lava, rising above the surface of the water, and then suddenly lowered to the depth of 10,000 feet. Termure attributed the dive time to the geological concept of the modern era because this area is still unstable and the lava has not yet disintegrated. Of course, what according to geological concepts belongs to the present could have actually happened, say, 15,000 years ago. Swedish researchers have recently taken sedimentary rock cores from the bottom of the Atlantic along the coast of West Africa. They found silicon algae, microscopic forms of plant life, that grow only in fresh water. This led them to the idea that a lake once existed here, and that this part of the middle elevation in the Atlantic was above water at one time. Professor Charles Shakert was looking for Atlantis to the west of the African coast, and claimed to see traces of it in the 5 Cape Verde Islands and 3 of the Canary Island groups. Rocks, plants, and animals spoke of an undoubted connection with Africa of the Tertiary period. These islands are fragments of Greater Africa, according to the professor. Is it possible to assume that a human-inhabited continent was flooded by the sea within a few hours? Even the most notorious proponents of the Atlantis theory do not accept the part of Plato's narrative where he talks about the catastrophe that happened in a day. However, according to some astronomers, Venus could have come so close to the Earth that clouds of its vapors penetrating into the Earth's atmosphere led to a flood that in a short time was able to absorb Atlantis. The catastrophes that occurred in the already foreseeable historical times show that some past tragedy of the Earth could serve as the basis of Plato's legend. At the beginning of the 19th century, giant waves, the consequence of a major volcanic eruption, overwhelmed 2,000 square miles of India's territory, characterized by a high population density. Less than 2 centuries ago, most of Lisboa slid into the sea with a terrifying crash, and 60,000 people died in 6 minutes. Opponents of the existence of Atlantis go so far as to claim that Plato invented the whole story, trying to justify his own utopian ideas deployed in the book Republic. However, few people think so. Most opponents are ready to admit that some grains of truth have been preserved in the message of the ancient philosopher. Therefore, many brilliant minds continue to search for an explanation of this romantic legend. It is possible that the Phoenicians or other navigators of the past discovered America 1500 years before the Vikings and brought a message about this discovery to the Mediterranean. In Plato, we find some evidence of this. One of the most interesting passages of his books says, "The island Atlantis was on the way to other islands, and from these islands you can get to the entire opposite continent, which is surrounded by a real ocean." The source of the legend for Plato could be the fall of the Minoan Empire in Crete around 1400 BC. The residents of Crete concentrated all maritime trade between Europe, Asia, and Africa. They became rich thanks to their maritime power. The rulers of Crete lived in palaces similar to Plato's Atlantean palaces. Then something happened to the empire. The cities were captured by foreigners and destroyed. The defeat of the Minoans was so severe that the empire seemed to disappear from the face of the earth. The Phoenicians became the masters of the Mediterranean basin, and the Phoenician sailor was the main figure in the Mediterranean Sea. Maybe Plato's story reflected the events in Crete. It is difficult, however, to imagine how the land that the writer saw behind the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, could be confused with Crete. True, in those days, traveling even from Egypt to Crete was a difficult undertaking for coastal navigators, and this distance seemed to them to be much longer than it actually was. Professor Leo Frobenius, known for his discoveries in Zimbabwe, for 30 years sent expeditions to West Africa in search of the country of Senegambia. He was quite sure that the Phoenicians had first discovered the Canary Islands and only then landed on the coast of West Africa. They did not understand that this was Africa and believed that they had discovered a new continent, which they called Atlantis. Another school of scientists places Atlantis in Spain. As evidence of the Atlanteans stay there, they point to cave drawings that far surpass the abilities of primitive men. According to the following theory, Atlantis is located on the site of the famous Mareth salt marshes in western Libya. There is reason to assume that the fields and buildings of the Neolithic people were suddenly flooded by water flows as a result of the earthquake. The people who escaped from this disaster had to flee from Mareth. Traces of them were found in Wales. Therefore, the refugees managed to get even to Britain. Followers of this theory claim that under the salt marshes, by the way, well known to the soldiers of the Second World War, if they are excavated, those marshes, settlements of the Sunken race that's mentioned in Plato's legend of Atlantis will be found. Green pondered about the most acceptable explanation for all these theories and remembered that land has already been found under the sea. A large Dogger Bank in the North Sea rose above the water several thousand years ago, and trawlers brought up a lot of stone tools proving that it was once inhabited. In the sea near Heligoland, divers found stone walls. Some archaeologists think that they surrounded the temple of Poseidon on the royal island in Plato's Atlantis. The philosopher mentioned the substance orichalc, which the Atlanteans valued as highly as gold. It is believed that it can be identified with amber, which is often found in the waters near the island. The ivory mentioned by Plato, which to this day falls into the nets of trawlers fishing in the Dogger Bank, could well have been the bone of mammoths, walruses, and narwhals. The Atlanteans, actually the Frisians, undoubtedly exchanged amber and bone for silver and gold. Copper was mined on Heligoland. History knows that the inhabitants of the North Sea coast once sent a large military expedition to Greece and conquered the whole country, with the exception of Athens. We also find this fact in Plato. The process of flooding the land by melting glaciers in the North Sea was slow. Judging by Frisian folklore, the last territory disappeared into the sea only 700 years ago. The Frisians have always been at war with the sea. Their islands stretch along the coast of Europe, from Holland to Denmark, for almost 300 miles. Since the 13th century, the area of the islands of North Frisia has decreased from 1,000 to 100 square miles. Frisian legends, not without reason, talk about sunken villages and submerged fields. Therefore, the plateau in the North Sea can be considered Plato's Atlantis. Green liked this theory. It explains a lot in Plato. Although the North Sea is not located opposite the Pillars of Hercules, it lies at least beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. That is, the distant plateau of Dogger Bank is much more likely to be compared with the legendary Atlantis than the island of Crete. However, there were other floods, deluges in the prehistoric period. Therefore, researchers will probably find not just one Atlantis, but many remnants of land and the disappeared people in various parts of the ocean. Let me step aside from Green's narrative and point out the discovery by the Rashua Island in the Kuril Island chain of Russia. Really, there has to be more real scientific work and expeditions. But I think the Russian army now in full control of the nearby island of Matua, looking for something we can't even imagine. I think they know what's going on. And I put my information in the video that I made a few years ago, and it's in the Atlantis playlist. I urge you to look at it. The idea of Atlantis is worldwide. But let me go back to Green. Benjamin Jowett, an English scholar who translated Plato's work, remarked, "Isn't it wonderful that several pages of dialogues have grown into a big legend that includes not only European nations? It turned out to be so appropriate to the people's mindset that it took root in every country. The tale of Atlantis is a figment of the imagination, but it has never ceased to interest people." And in fact, the British Prime Minister William Gladstone was interested in it so much that he decided to send a warship to search for Atlantis, and only the veto of the Treasury, that was afraid of large expenses, suspended this venture. But Mrs. Elizabeth Blossom of Cleveland, Ohio, was not deterred by such trifling considerations. The schooner Blossom, hired by her, had been searching for Atlantis in the vast South Atlantic for several years. It was several decades ago, when scientists did not yet have the perfect radars and echo-sounders that they're armed with now. However, many islands were explored in search of, as the head of the expedition put it, the missing link that would connect Atlantis with today, and would transfer the lost continent from the realm of mythology to the realm of history. The expedition members climbed the mountains of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands in the hope of finding the remains of an Atlantic civilization. They stayed on St. Helena, this ancient piece of land in the middle of the ocean, for so long that the two of the crew married local girls and stayed on the island. The expedition found no traces of Atlantis. Well, it was not the first to fail in these searches, and many more will be searching for the lost continent. In simple words, I will tell you about an old story. Plato began the most interesting of mankind's fairy tales. Atlantis, if it ever existed, disappeared before the first maps appeared, drawn by the hand of brave navigators. But on the maps of the British Admiralty issued in the 20th century, you can still find islands marked with mysterious letters, meaning the position is doubtful or existence is doubtful. The first discoverers, armed with primitive sectants, often made mistakes that were corrected quite recently, and some inaccuracies associated with mapping remote areas have not been eliminated to this day. A considerable number of such lapses contain maps of the seas washing Africa, and lots containing descriptions of ship voyages in the south of the continent. Often you find islands on the map that were never discovered later, and you ask yourself this question: what did the sailors actually see? At the end of the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company sent ship after ship to the southern tip of Africa in the hope of finding the island of Santa Helena Nova, which was supposed to be somewhere between the coast of the mainland and the island of St. Helena. These hopes were further increased when the ship's carpenter Ludwig Lassen made his statement to the company representatives in Batavia. He claimed to have been captured by the Portuguese and served on one of the Portuguese ships. One day, Klassen said, the ship came to an island where cattle roamed in herds. Vegetables and fruits grew luxuriantly. He did not know the way to this island, but he was convinced that it was located near St. Helena. Klassen visited the island twice and watched the Portuguese build forts there. He said that the island has a convenient bay and therefore excellent parking. The island was also depicted on Portuguese maps. The Dutch fell for this bait. They sent whole flotillas scouring the South Atlantic in a chain-like formation. The new island of St. Helena could not be seen, but it remained on the maps for a long time. Even many years later, the skippers still did not lose hope of finding it, and passing near St. Helena forced the lookouts to climb and look around. And only at the end of the 18th century, the non-existent island disappeared from the maps. Much longer than Santa Helena Nova, there were also seemingly more real island, Saxenburg, which according to assumptions was located somewhere at the 30 degrees south latitude, halfway between South America and South Africa. The island was first reported in 1670 by Captain Lindemann. It was also observed by two people from the topmast, who saw a narrow peak similar to a column. More than 100 years later, the existence of the island was confirmed by Captain Galloway from the American ship Fanny. He reported that the island did not disappear from sight for 4 hours. Galloway also observed high hills and even a cliff on one of them. In the first half of the 19th century, Captain J.O. Head from the ship True Britain also saw the island. Judging by his logbook, Saxenburg should have been about the same place where it was observed, and both previously reported about the islands by other captains. However, a very experienced sailor, Captain James Horsburgh, tried in vain to discover Saxenburg a few years later, and in general, no one had ever seen it. It was suggested that the people who reported about the island saw clouds that accurately imitated the land, which for a long time did not change their outlines on the horizon. Other similar reports are explained by floating islands, large accumulations of seaweed, bundles of reed and grass carried out by tropical rivers into the sea. Sometimes these islands can even carry the earth. Moreover, it is enough for several small trees to grow on it. It is not surprising that the sailors in the old days saw the islands, although there was no land in fact. How to explain the existence of an island called Big? It is marked on the old maps of the South Atlantic with the following legend. At 45 degrees south latitude, there is a very large, pleasant island discovered by Anthony Laroche, a native of England. There is good port in the eastern part of the island, where Laroche found trees, fresh water, and fish. They didn't see any people, although they were on the island for 6 days. Other sailors also tried to find that big island. They encountered signs of land, the pale color of seawater, fragments of trees, rough algae, but the pleasant island itself never appeared before the human eye again. However, further to the south, huge icebergs were found, which carried rocks and soil, and were sometimes marked as islands. However, it is impossible to imagine that Laroche had such an iceberg in mind. In 1829, Captain Robson of the barge Anna went to Tristan da Cunha, and then he sailed to Mauritius. 6 days after the ship left Tristan, he wrote in the logbook, "I saw rocks protruding about 8 feet above the water, waves crashing against them. The rocks formed a kind of a horseshoe. They are overgrown with long kelp." If you try to find the reef described by Captain Robson, then it would have to be somewhere at right angles to the way that all ships pass around the southern tip of Africa, heading east. Hundreds of American whalers have passed this way, and they would certainly have found sharp rocks. It is therefore understandable why the captains doubted the existence of the Robson Reef. One of them very cautiously remarked, "Isn't it possible to assume that sometimes dead whales, a flock of stingrays, or other sea monsters are mistaken for banks and rocks?" One island, or rather a group of shark rocks in the middle of the ocean, still cause controversy among geologists and fans of the theory of Atlantis. Green had a chance to observe at one time this mysterious and lifeless vision, the rocks of St. Paul near the equator between Brazil and West Africa. Green was on the battered mail steamer Arlanza from Rio to England. Suddenly the steamer came too close to the rocks. Then the siren roared, and the officers on the bridge bent to their binoculars, but only the cries of the disturbed birds were heard in response. If shipwrecked people happened to be there, what joy Arlanza would bring them with its appearance. The dangerous rocks of St. Paul have been known to sailors for several centuries and are marked on all maps. A little over 100 years ago, Captain Sander from the ship Francois Casimir reported a large black mass a few miles south of the rocks. And the maritime authorities reacted to this message skeptically and even with ridicule. The navigation instructions said bluntly, "This statement of Captain Sander lacks only credibility." And yet, a new report about 2 islands rising in the South Atlantic near the rocks of St. Paul had appeared. This happened in June of 1931. The discovery was reported by the English liner Leland, and the Brazilian cruiser immediately went there to raise the Brazilian flag on those islands. The rocks of St. Paul are mysterious because they do not reveal their volcanic or coral origin, which would be expected from small oceanic islands of tropical waters. The whole group is only half a mile in circumference. The highest rock rises 60 feet above the ocean level. During the voyage of the Beagle, Charles Darwin managed to land here only with great difficulty and anxiety due to the multitude of sharks and strong surf. However, Darwin paid more attention to terns than to geological structure of the island. When an expedition from Scotia visited these places at the beginning of the 20th century, scientists were struck by black rocks made of stone, which cannot be found anywhere else. Wasn't it a fragment of the lost Atlantis? Dr. Peary wrote later. And if so, how did it turn into a sharp peak that rises from a narrow pedestal at the bottom of the ocean? In the South Atlantic, a classic example of hide-and-seek island is the Bouvet Island, covered with ice, overwhelmed by storm waves and forever shrouded in fog. It lies 1,600 miles southwest of Cape Town. This is one of the most secluded pieces of land in the world. For 2 centuries, there has not been a sailor who could say with certainty whether Bouvet represents one island or 3, and even now it is fraught with mysteries. The island was discovered in 1739 by the French naval officer Bouvet, who, as far as he could do it in a solid fog, determined the position of the island. Visibility was poor, and Bouvet did not rule out the possibility that he could see some cape of the Antarctic continent. A few decades later, Captain Cook passed through here, but he did not notice anything and announced that Bouvet had mapped an iceberg. And yet, at the beginning of the 19th century, 2 English whalers rediscovered the island of Bouvet. One of the skippers, Captain Lindsay, called it by his name. After him, a sea hunter, Captain Norris, the owner of 2 small single-masted vessels, the Lively and the Mary, came across the island. Norris did not know that the island was already discovered, so he renamed it Liverpool Island. The weather worsened and it began to snow and rain. Norris never landed on the island. And that's where we come to the enigma. Moving to the northeast, Norris saw another island here, according to his calculations, lying 45 miles from Liverpool or Bouvet. He named this new piece of land Thompson Island, and the 3 hills near it are marked on the map as chimney rocks, or craters. Soon after, Norris returns to the first island, and hoping to find the seal rookery, he sent boats ashore. By order of the captain, the sailors raised the English flag on the rock, therefore attributing the island to the British crown. One day a storm broke out, and the sailors were forced to spend 6 days on the island without shelter or fuel. They buried themselves in the snow, eating raw seal meat. Norris wrote this about Bouvet. The boats went around and nothing was visible but sheer cliffs. The island bears obvious signs of volcanic origin. It is nothing but solid slag cut through by powerful lava flows, similar to black glass with white veins. A copy of the logbook from the Mary, stored in the archives of the British Admiralty, said that Norris described Thompson Island as small and low. Therefore, he could not confuse Thompson with Bouvet, on which top of the volcano rises. There was another person who saw both Bouvet and Thompson at the same time. It was Captain Fuller, who sailed here in 1893 on the American fishing vessel Francis Allen. However, when the German search vessel Valdivia came here for five years later, Bouvet Island was in place, but Thompson disappeared without a trace. Since then, other vessels equipped with radio installations and various modern means of navigation have recorded the location of Bouvet Island with great accuracy, but have not been able to locate Thompson Island. Among them we can mention the British ship Milford with the Antarctic explorer Admiral Evans on board. It was here in 1934, and 20 years later the South African frigate Transvaal anchored at Bouvet. Green talked to two eyewitnesses who got to Bouvet by boat. One of them was his old friend W.J. Copenhagen. He talked about the avalanches that fell into the sea when the Milford circled Bouvet, about the strong wind and high waves, and recalled the words of Admiral Evans. Navigation in these low latitudes, where there are a lot of iceberg, is like riding a bicycle through a cemetery. You see a tombstone in front of you and turn to the side only to find a dozen others on your way. A Norwegian whaler visited Bouvet. At that time, Norway decided to claim the island. The boat from the whaler approached from the leeward side to the iceberg, which froze near the surf-swept shore. One Norwegian sailor landed on land with some difficulty, walked around the island, and finally found himself on the edge of the extinct volcano. The island, he said, looks like a crater sunk deep into the ocean, but its top still rises 3,000 feet into the clouds. On this ill-fated piece of land, among the snow and ice, there is a trace of human habitation, an old coal stove left here apparently by American seal hunters in the 19th century. So Bouvet is in place, but it is also clear that Thompson Island doesn't exist. Nevertheless, experts of our days, that would be the mid-20th century, when Green was writing, are not inclined to regard Norris's message about the two separate islands as false. Such an authority as Dr. Stanley Camp was on board of the Discovery 2 research vessel when it entered the Bouvet waters. He was trying to see the second island in clear weather and made the following message. We searched in all directions in the surrounding waters, surveyed about 6,000 square miles of sea, and could not find a trace of Thompson Island. The island remains a mystery. Norris's message is so detailed that it is impossible not to believe in it at all. Therefore, it should be assumed that 1. Norris took an iceberg for an island. 2. His compass lied godlessly. 3. The island once existed and then disappeared. It seems to me that the iceberg theory is the most likely, because in some conditions black moraines can resemble rocks and islands. Dr. E.N. Redmose Brown, one of the first Antarctic researchers or explorers, points out that it is easier to map an island than to erase it from it. He says, I know a captain who has been sailing among the ice for 20 years. One day he veered off course and lost a whole hour hoping to make sure that the vague shadow on the horizon was an ice mountain and not a new island. Brown himself could not, however, explain Captain Norris's strange report about two islands in a place where only one exists now. So I will leave Green's writings for now, but I do want to point out that Bouvet is more interesting than even he described. I don't know much more about it, and this is not my area of interest, but the whole waters of the area should be of great interest. And I think Green was pointing us to a very interesting location, but what can civilian researchers do? It will be probably up to the military to do the expeditions to the area, and hopefully, maybe through them, be it Russian, American, or some other country that sends expeditions to that area, maybe they will tell us more of what they find in those turbulent waters. But let's get back to Africa. In South Africa, about 150 kilometers west of Port Maputo, Mozambique, a giant stone city had been discovered not that long ago. It became possible to determine the age of the site by measuring the erosion rate of the dolerite. The 1,500 square kilometer metropolis was believed to have been built between 160,000 and 200,000 years ago. The ruins consist of huge stone circles, most of which are buried in the sand and can be seen only from the air or with the help of satellite imagery. Concentric circled walls are best seen from the air. They are estimated to be, again, 1,500 square kilometers, although each wall is only 3.5 meters high in places. The walls would have been far taller before the 200,000 years of weather erosion. The geology of the site is also interesting. Situated beside numerous gold mines, it has been suggested that they were the first gold mine miners. The ancient town is thought to be part of a larger network of 10,000 square kilometers. The organized nature of this ancient community and a road network connecting it to the terraced agriculture suggest that the metropolis was home to a highly advanced civilization. The geology of the site is quite interesting too because of the numerous gold mines located in the area. According to researchers, this ancient civilization could have practiced gold mining. What is quite curious, no one has ever wondered about the origin and the age of the stone circles before, despite the fact that local residents have encountered them multiple times. So, in 2007, Michael Tellinger, researcher and writer, quite passionate about human origins, and Jonathan Heine, a local fireman and pilot, decided to explore the site. Later, the results of their research inspired Tellinger to write a book about temples of the African gods. According to Tellinger, the evidence they found suggests a completely different perspective on the history of humankind. According to the conventional version of human history, the first civilization on Earth was Sumer and emerged in southern Mesopotamia about 6,000 years ago. But what if there was another earlier civilization that was then lost in the mists of time? The photographs, artifacts, and evidence we accumulated point towards a lost civilization that has never before been and precedes all others, not for a few hundred years, but a few thousand years, but many thousands of years, according to Tellinger. And Tellinger believes that this ancient African metropolis is the oldest structure built by the humans on Earth. In fact, he thinks that the Sumerians and the Egyptians inherited knowledge from this advanced civilization. By calculating the rate of dolerite erosion, the structure itself, again, I wanted to repeat it, has been dated to 200,000 odd years old, although this date remains controversial. Well, as I said, Tellinger wrote about it extensively in his book. Recently, an Ankh has been discovered on one of the walls of that ancient southern African city. Ankh, or Key of Life, is an ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic symbol. So, are you wondering how on earth there could be a symbol of an Egyptian deity thousands of years before the Egyptian civilization emerged? That's what people ask. Historians believe the Egyptians were the first to worship the deities etched all over Egyptian temple walls, but it is more likely that the Egyptians inherited their beliefs from this southern African culture. The photographs, again, that Tellinger collected and all other data point out to many thousands of years of history. And apparently Michael Tellinger has reportedly received many phone calls from archaeologists and scientists commending him on his work. And But also, apparently, he still has not received formal acclaim or support for this discovery. Potentially, it's the collective hubris of theorists, wanting their theories of historical civilization to remain valid, according to him. Despite the Sumerian tablets of the King's List, which detail a list of kings spanning 224,000 years of time period, 10 of which are kings documented to have existed before the biblical flood. Archaeologists don't want to deal with or acknowledge these time periods, according to Tellinger. The ancient cities in Maputo not only validate but match the time periods documented by the Sumerians. Unfortunately, theorists and historians still have no desire to let go of their previous postulations. For the record, there is evidence now that the first advanced civilization existed in South Africa. I personally have no doubts about South Africa, and I want to point my audience to Namibia and say that you will find, one day, humanity will find incredible artifacts in the sands of the deserts and in the waters of Namibia. And I go by my research, by Ivan Yefremov's writings, and basically what I have concluded after years of doing, like I said, my own research. But now it looks like Africa may be the cradle of mankind and location of at least some of the outposts of Atlantis. I will bring you more information about the search for Atlantis. I have to tell you about the incredible book which was written by Soviet scientist Shershov, and actually his incredible fate. I'll tell you later. And also other discoveries of interest. I think those who support my research, and if you can, you will find links in the description to this article. Thank you. Please subscribe to my channel and tell others.